The Mississippi River often remembers what men forget. Long before maps traced its serpentine course, before the thunder of steamboats echoed along its banks, and long before the country would tear itself apart in war, the river flowed quietly through a land in formation. In the early 19th century, when the United States was still a fragile experiment stretching westward with cautious confidence, a boy was born whose life would intertwine with the river, the land, and the monumental events that would shape the nation. Henry Caldwell. Henry's father, Andrew Caldwell, was born in Pennsylvania, a state still pulsing with stories of the American Revolution. He had grown up hearing tales of men marching through snow, sleeping in fields, and risking everything for liberty. These tales settled deep in his bones as he labored in Philadelphia shipyards, the scent of tar and timber mixing with ambition and possibility. But by early adulthood, the call of the frontier proved stronger than the city's promise. Land beckoned beyond the Appalachians, fertile, unsettled, and full of opportunity. Andrew packed his few belongings and journeyed west, joining thousands of others who sought to carve lives from the wilderness. He settled near the Ohio River, a lifeline feeding into the greater Mississippi, where dense forests stretched endlessly. Here, Andrew built a cabin from rough-hewn logs and cleared fields with unrelentless labor. It was in this setting, in the heat of summer 1815, that Henry Caldwell was born. From the earliest days, Henry was shaped by the land and the rhythms of frontier life. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the earthy scent of river mud, the roar of the Ohio, and the hum of cicadas in summer evenings formed the backdrop of his earliest memories. By dawn, he tended the small family farm alongside his sister Margaret, carrying water, feeding chickens, and learning to cultivate corn and vegetables. Education was modest but intentional. By candlelight, his father taught him to read, write, and understand numbers, often translating lessons into practical surveying exercises, measuring plots of land, calculating fence lines, and mapping the property. Even as a child, Henry absorbed the understanding that the natural world and human action were intertwined, that knowledge could be a tool to shape life itself. Life on the frontier was not merely labor and learning, it was a study of survival. Floods could wash away months of toil. Illness, sudden and unpredictable, could strike without warning. Henry witnessed neighbors fall victim to fevers or accidents, learning early that resilience was as vital as skill. Yet amidst hardship, moments of wonder abounded. He memorized the night sky, recognized the calls of birds, tracked animal footprints, and marveled at the flow of the Ohio, imagining one day charting its entire course. The river was a living entity, nourishing and destructive, constant yet unpredictable, a symbol that would shape his life. By his mid-teens, Henry began accompanying his father and local surveyors on expeditions. Dense forests, treacherous rivers, and rolling hills became his classroom. He learned to use chains and compasses, to interpret topography, and to sketch preliminary maps. These excursions exposed him to human ambition in all forms. Settlers claiming new plots, traders negotiating riverside commerce, and indigenous communities confronting the encroachment of expansion. Observing both cooperation and conflict, Henry developed a keen sense of the fragility and complexity of life on the frontier. At 18, Henry left his family home to pursue surveying across the Western Territories. His work was physically demanding and mentally precise, taking him through forests untouched by settlement, prairies stretching beyond the horizon, and rivers swollen with spring rains. Each expedition deepened his understanding of geography, commerce, and the human will to claim and shape land. He mapped, measured, and observed, recording everything in journals that would later serve as a meticulous account of the frontier and the nation's growth. By the 1850s, Henry moved south to the Mississippi, settling along the lower river. The region dazzled him, sprawling plantations, bustling ports, and New Orleans alive with music, culture, and commerce. Yet the grandeur hid fragility. Wealth depended entirely on enslaved labor. Political tensions simmered and erupted as states debated secession and loyalty. Henry, a northern-born surveyor, navigated the delicate social landscape with discretion. He observed, measured, and recorded, a witness to both prosperity and inequality. By his mid-teens, Henry began accompanying his father and local surveyors on expeditions. Dense forests, treacherous rivers, and rolling hills became his classroom. He learned to use chains and compasses, to interpret topography, and to sketch preliminary maps. These excursions exposed him to human ambition in all forms. Settlers claiming new plots, traders negotiating riverside commerce, and indigenous communities confronting the encroachment of expansion. Observing both cooperation and conflict, Henry developed a keen sense of the fragility and complexity of life on the frontier. At 18, Henry left his family home to pursue surveying across the Western Territories. His work was physically demanding and mentally precise, taking him through forests untouched by settlement, prairies stretching beyond the horizon, and rivers swollen with spring rains. Each expedition deepened his understanding of geography, commerce, and the human will to claim and shape land. He mapped, measured, and observed, recording everything in journals that would later serve as a meticulous account of the frontier and the nation's growth. By the 1850s, Henry moved south to the Mississippi, settling along the lower river. The region dazzled him, sprawling plantations, bustling ports, and New Orleans alive with music, culture, and commerce. Yet the grandeur hid fragility. Wealth depended entirely on enslaved labor. Political tensions simmered and erupted as states debated secession and loyalty. Henry, a northern-born surveyor, navigated the delicate social landscape with discretion. He observed, measured, and recorded, a witness to both prosperity and inequality. When Abraham Lincoln's election prompted secession, Henry's world shifted. The Civil War engulfed the nation. His surveying skills became invaluable to Confederate engineers, officers, and strategists. He mapped rivers for supply lines, assessed terrain for fortifications, and recorded troop movements. He witnessed the horror and resilience of battle, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and countless skirmishes along the Mississippi River Valley. He watched enslaved men and women seek freedom, joining Union lines and forming new communities even amidst chaos. His journals chronicled not just strategy and geography, but humanity under strain, courage in adversity, and the unyielding passage of history. The outbreak of war in 1861 transformed the Mississippi Valley into a theater of strategy, suffering, and relentless motion. Henry Caldwell, now in his mid-40s, was deeply embedded in the region's landscape, a man whose knowledge of rivers, forests, and settlements had become unmatched. When the first volleys echoed across southern towns, he was called upon not as a soldier, but as a surveyor and logistician, a guide for armies moving through the treacherous and ever-changing terrain along the Mississippi and its tributaries. His first assignments took him to small towns along the river, where the Confederate forces sought to fortify positions and anticipate Union advances. Henry mapped defensive earthworks, measured river bends for artillery placement, and advised on supply routes. Each day, the war revealed its complexity. Skirmishes erupted without warning. Rivers that had once been avenues of commerce became battlegrounds. Towns emptied as families fled advancing armies, leaving homes vulnerable to both looting and artillery fire. Henry, moving carefully through these landscapes, saw firsthand the toll on civilians. Children huddled in cellars, mothers carrying what little they could save, and elderly families watching fields burn that had been cultivated for generations. The siege of Vicksburg marked a turning point in his wartime experience. Henry observed the city's fortifications with professional detachment, yet he could not ignore the human suffering surrounding him. The Union Army, relentless in its campaign, surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and forcing Confederate defenders into desperate measures. Civilians endured weeks of scarcity, resorting to eating mules, pets, and wild plants. Henry recorded the layout of forts, the approach of supply lines, and the position of artillery, knowing that his meticulous observations would one day inform history, even as he felt the weight of the human tragedy unfolding. Elsewhere, he witnessed the ebb and flow of armies along smaller rivers and in the delta regions. Gunboats patrolled the waters, asserting Union dominance, while occasionally becoming trapped by low levels or concealed obstructions. Confederate forces attempted ambushes from hidden banks and thick forests, their efforts often thwarted by the sheer logistical superiority of Union navigation. Henry navigated this dangerous environment daily, often under threat from stray bullets or the treacherous currents of a swollen river. Each measurement and sketch he made could mean the difference between life and death for those relying on his expertise. But the war was not only measured in maps and artillery. Henry became acutely aware of the social upheaval it created. Enslaved men and women, sensing the Union's advance, fled plantations in growing numbers. They sought refuge along Union lines, forming improvised communities and camps that became centers of resilience and hope. Some joined the United States Colored Troops, asserting their agency through military service. Henry observed these movements closely, noting their courage, discipline, and determination in his journals. These acts of defiance and hope left an indelible impression, revealing that the war was as much about social transformation as territorial conquest. Henry's observations extended beyond immediate strategy. He recorded the subtle shifts in towns along the river. Markets emptied and refilled, families returned to damaged homes, churches served as hospitals, and schools were repurposed to shelter the wounded. The war transformed daily life in ways both visible and unseen, and Henry chronicled every nuance. He understood that when the fighting ended, the nation would be forced to reckon not only with military defeat, but also with the profound social changes wrought by emancipation and displacement. Amid the constant movement of armies, Henry's expertise also brought him into direct contact with commanders and engineers. He navigated the delicate balance between loyalty, professionalism, and morality. He was acutely aware of the Confederate cause, but maintained a degree of neutrality in his work, believing that survival, order, and historical record-keeping were paramount. Yet the sights he witnessed, the dead, the suffering, the heroic persistence of ordinary men and women, altered his perspective, instilling a sense of responsibility not only to the present, but to the generations who would study the war's consequences. By 1863, the conflict had reached its zenith along the Mississippi. Vicksburg fell after weeks of siege, splitting the Confederacy and solidifying Union control of the river. Henry documented the aftermath. Buildings reduced to rubble, fields left fallow, displaced populations struggling to rebuild amid uncertainty. He noted how the war's devastation reshaped both geography and human behavior, and he recognized that these changes would influence the South for decades. Even after the major battle subsided, Henry's work remained crucial. Union campaigns across Louisiana and Mississippi continued to disrupt Confederate supply lines. He mapped river routes for gunboats, identified areas for temporary encampments, and assisted in the reestablishment of communication networks. Each expedition reinforced a central truth. The Mississippi was the lifeblood of the region, and whoever controlled its currents controlled much of the South's fate. But Henry's wartime perspective extended beyond military strategy. He documented the lives of freedmen, the operation of contraband camps, and the emergence of informal educational and religious institutions. These details, meticulously recorded, revealed the resilience of communities striving to reconstruct their lives amidst chaos. He noted both hope and danger. While many found safety and opportunity with Union forces, others faced retaliation from hostile neighbors, Confederate sympathizers, or the harshness of war-torn environments. By the war's end in 1865, Henry had become more than a surveyor. He was a chronicler of transformation. He had observed the collapse of old social hierarchies, the rise of new forms of agency, and the indomitable will of ordinary people to survive and adapt. When the guns finally silent, Henry understood that the war's legacy would not reside in maps or reports alone, but in the lived experience of those who endured their trials and emerged into a new, uncertain world. The war had ended, yet the South remained suspended between destruction and rebirth. In 1865, Henry returned to a region scarred by battles, economic collapse, and social upheaval. Cities and towns bore the marks of artillery, abandoned homes, and deserted plantations. Cotton fields, once the engines of wealth, lay overgrown, and river ports that had once teemed with trade now hosted only the occasional steamboat struggling to navigate the changing currents. Henry's expertise as a surveyor and chronicler became indispensable in this fragile landscape. Federal authorities, seeking to stabilize the region and oversee reconstruction, enlisted his skills to map districts, assess resources, and evaluate the state of infrastructure. Bridges had been destroyed, roads washed away, and levees breached. The Mississippi River, which had sustained commerce and human life for centuries, now demanded repair and management to prevent further disaster. Henry moved through towns and plantations, measuring, recording, and advising on rebuilding efforts, noting everything from soil conditions to riverbank erosion, understanding that the land itself had been altered as drastically as its people. Beyond the physical landscape, Henry witnessed profound social transformation. Freedmen, who had once labored under bondage, were now asserting independence in myriad ways. Men and women returned to lands their families had tilled for generations, negotiating labor contracts, purchasing plots where possible, and establishing schools to educate the next generation. Churches became centers of political organization and community leadership, providing not only spiritual guidance but practical support for families navigating a society that was still hostile in many quarters. Henry moved quietly among these emerging communities, documenting their progress with meticulous detail. He recorded the establishment of schools in small towns, often held in repurposed cabins or under trees, where children wrote on slate boards and learned reading, arithmetic, and history. He noted the resilience of women who organized cooperatives and mutual aid societies, managing food, clothing, and shelter in the absence of government support. In his journals, he sketched layouts of new settlements, marking churches, schools, and communal buildings, capturing both the ingenuity of human endeavor and the fragility of progress. Yet Reconstruction was not a period of unmitigated hope. Henry witnessed opposition and violence in towns where freedmen attempted to assert their rights. Secret paramilitary groups sought to intimidate, suppress, and terrorize black communities, burning homes and attacking those who dared participate in political life. Freedmen's Bureau agents struggled to maintain order, often confronting resistance from local officials and landowners who rejected federal authority. Henry, observing these tensions, recorded both the bravery of those resisting oppression and the brutality of those determined to restore the antebellum order. The political landscape shifted constantly. When Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts in 1867, the South was divided into military districts, and new constitutions were mandated to include universal male suffrage and civil rights protections. Henry assisted in these efforts, mapping districts, evaluating land use, and providing technical expertise to officials working on implementation. He traveled extensively, witnessing the rise of black political leaders who were elected to local offices, served on juries, and participated in state legislatures. Their presence, often met with hostility, marked an unprecedented transformation in American democracy. Education, infrastructure, and political engagement flourished where federal oversight remained strong. Roads were repaired, levees reinforced, and public buildings reconstructed. Henry chronicled these advancements with a careful eye, noting not only the successes but also the unevenness of progress. Some communities thrived, while others languished under neglect or deliberate obstruction. Each setback, each victory, became a record of the nation's struggle to redefine itself in the aftermath of a civil war fought over liberty, labor, and human dignity. By the early 1870s, the economic fragility of the South became apparent. National financial crises, including the Panic of 1873, halted development projects and disrupted commerce. Railroads stalled, banks failed, and farmers struggled to secure credit. Henry documented the economic collapse and its impact on Reconstruction, noting how progress achieved in education and governance was threatened by broader instability. Despite these challenges, he continued his work, surveying, recording, and advising on rebuilding efforts, determined to preserve the hard-won gains of the decade. Socially, Henry observed how ordinary people adapted to a new reality. Freedmen established businesses, cultivated independent farms, and formed organizations to protect their rights. White Southerners who had lost wealth or power sought to reassert influence, sometimes peacefully through political participation, often violently through intimidation and subversion. Henry's journals detailed these interactions with impartial rigor, noting patterns of resistance and resilience, documenting the fragile balance between progress and reaction that defined Reconstruction. As federal troops gradually withdrew from Southern districts, tensions increased. Political rights once secured for Black citizens faced suppression through voter intimidation, restrictive laws, and acts of terror. Henry, now in his late 50s, continued to travel and document, increasingly aware that the gains of Reconstruction were both monumental and impermanent. He recorded towns where freedmen continued to exercise agency despite threats, schools operating under constant peril, and families rebuilding amid uncertainty. His observations became a testament to both human perseverance and the challenges of social transformation. By 1877, with the compromise that ended federal oversight in the South, Henry's work took on a new urgency. He understood that while formal protections had been withdrawn, the lessons of the past decade, the resilience of communities, the courage of leaders, the strength of education and organization would endure beyond political setbacks. His journals captured not only events, but the emotions, ambitions, and fears of those who lived through a transformative era. They recorded the reality that history is not linear or permanent, but a continuum shaped by the choices of those who act and endure. Henry settled near the Mississippi River in his later years, reflecting on a lifetime spent observing change. He continued writing, compiling maps, journals, and reflections that would become invaluable records of the nation's evolution. The river, constant and enduring, mirrored the flow of history itself, relentless, sometimes violent, yet shaping life and memory with each passing season. In these final years, Henry contemplated the legacy of his work. Not in monuments, honors, or accolades, but in the meticulous recording of human endeavor, resilience, and the passage of generations. He understood that while political tides shifted, the cumulative efforts of individuals, teachers, freedmen, settlers, surveyors,